right, so I got to ask you, Tim, do you have any strong feelings or opinions on drums?
Well, I'm a longtime listener, first time caller of the show here, and I have to say that the rhythm of life are the drums, and I think on this podcast specifically, second to only the Holy Spirit, an impact on my life. So.
All right, we'll see. I think
I'm glad nothing that we've said has actually impacted his life. It's just those drums.
it's just the drums.
Oh, you are those guys.
Oh,
He actually only listens to the first 10 seconds of the podcast, and he's like, "That's sufficient."
As soon as I get out of bed, I hit that,
That's
and then I'm ready to go for the day.
there we go. Well, someday we're going to compile all those when I'm not too lazy to do it.
There's a lot.
All those drum
There's a lot of drum
conversations.
I'm just so glad that there's two Tims here today,
Yeah.
so that I can say, "What do you think, Tim?" and see who answers.
Well, just remember, Tim, this is my show. Oh, gosh.
Definitely not my show. We already know
right.
that. Yeah.
Oh, man. You know what? In all, without jest, as I keep picking lint off this table because I don't know what to do with my hands, I've thought about this a couple of times. Like, I don't think of this as a show. I don't want this to be a show.
Sure.
Right? You know, and I know we're just joking, having a good time. But, like, I think it is important to me that people realize that, like, everything we do here, we hope it has a purpose, right? We hope that God is using it in a way that he sees fit to use it for.
Yes.
You know, and so, like, it doesn't matter if, like, we get a bunch of subscribers or people listening, and you know, people may never know just how funny and smart and intelligent we are, and how much we bring to the table. But if the right person hears the word that God needs them to hear,
Right.
and it's through our conversation,
Right.
then all of this becomes worth all of those conversations. It becomes worth having to spend all of this time with you,
Right. In this small room.
in a small room, and all of the other rooms that
we've been through. Right.
and having to drive out to 98 Dynamics.
I know.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't we talk about why there's a second Tim here?
First Timothy. Is your name Timothy? Is it or just Tim?
Timothy. Yep.
First is your
First
name
Timothy.
First Timothy. It's
Second Timothy.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
I'm gonna change that on my phone right now. First Timothy's called.
I like to anything that I say out of my own, I like to refer to as Third Timothy. But Tim, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit about who you are?
Tim Dreyer, 36 years old, and I was born and raised here in St. Louis. Moved around a bit, and just recently moved back about a year ago. Found Southside Church of God, and that's been our home since we got back here. I run a little contracting business. I've been a carpenter since I graduated high school, and
Much like Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
much like Jesus, and love the Lord since birth, just like our Lord and Savior.
That's right.
So yeah, artistic background. So really, the Lord, arts, and building have been impactful in my life. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, the reason we have you on today is we've had some conversations before this, and you've had a life in which God's led you through some ups and some downs, had some different occurrences. Just as most people experience, life is not a steady line. You go through things,
peaks
right?
and valleys.
And we on our last podcast we recorded, Brandon's wife Carly was here, and we talked about mentorship and how we have these opportunities to share, as long as we're in sound doctrine, to share these experiences with others,
right,
to help people grow, to help people develop, to help them get to where God is leading them as well. And that's something that we want to do here in the Physics of Faith. Is we would like to continue to have more opportunities for people to share testimonies about the things that God's led them through, the things that God's done in their life, that other people might see what God can do for them as well. Mm-hmm. So you've had it on your heart to essentially kind of develop and get better at giving a testimony and helping others give their testimony as well. And so we thought, hey, well, this seems like we're in alignment of like what you feel God wants you to do with your life, and what we hope that God wants to do with this podcast, right? So that's why you're here. So we said, let's do this. Let's get together and let's have this conversation. So why don't we just kind of go back to kind of go to the beginning here of your story, and like, who were you? What were you?
Birthday, social security.
All the pertinent details. So let's just
go back as far as you want.
Yeah.
But probably not too far.
So take us where you'd like to start. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point because, like we were talking before we started today, and what I try to make a big point, or the point that I want to make in doing this, hopefully somewhat often or on a regular basis, is to show that when I was younger, and I say younger as in graduating high school and before, there wasn't a lot of thinking. There wasn't a lot of extra effort.
He's just describing every teenager right now. No thinking, no effort.
There was security and safe and comfortable, and that was a lot of my early life. We're in Middle America, and I felt, looking back on it now, it was just kind of like a zombie life of nothing. There was no. There was no spirit. There was no excitement. There was no drive or ambition. It was just kind of the motions. And I feel like there had been a formatted sheet of how to live and what you do. And for the most part, people just follow that. But as I'll get into, I had a few ignitions where some things kind of just clicked for me. And, I started looking at things a little differently. So, again, early life, I grew up in the church. I was born and raised in the Lutheran church. And
good Protestant.
That's right.
That's right, yeah.
Baptized as an infant,
Okay.
Which was their understanding. And, church life was good. I had no problem going, and my parents did a good job of there'd be conversations throughout the week as well, so it wasn't just kind of a superficial thing. And they still practice and go to the same church down the street. I was a very just generic kid of sports, school. Generic in the sense of the people that I. In the sense of the people that I hung out with. Again, like zero extra effort when it came to school. And, then I got older and high school came and it was, the parties, and I tried to play football, but, this is kind of interesting.
You tried to play football? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. I did, but I was constantly getting called for personal fouls because I would get so emotional on the field, and then I would just go and make a bad decision, and cause a 15-year penalty.
What, do you play defense? Offense?
A little bit of both. Yeah, I was a
wide receiver, defensive back.
Yeah.
You just have the frame.
Yeah.
For a high school wide receiver defensive back.
Yeah, that was me.
The rest of this podcast is just going to be us tossing him throws out in the front of the church.
That's right.
Just watching him catch.
Yeah.
Play one-on-one. Yeah. I didn't
We're going
know
to
that.
break
That's
down your tape. Yeah.
I love how you said average, though, because I remember when we were talking about your story, you were like, I'm a C student. So immediately,
C student.
I just average in everything. Grades, just normal kid life, got into trouble. Yeah.
It sounds like you just fit in everywhere. Like you were just doing the things that were acceptable, things that like you were in with whatever crowd you were in with.
Yeah, I like to say I kind of just I went with what came naturally, and then even with the things that came naturally, once I was confronted with some type of conflict or maybe the opportunity to advance, no, and it's not like I make a conscious decision to say no, but it would just stop there.
Like the ambition would stop. Like I just don't want to grow beyond this.
Yeah. But there were these flares of especially with the arts, everything from art class to singing to the performing arts where things kind of resonate. They resonated in the moment, but I wouldn't take them any further. Yeah, I don't know. That was just kind of interesting.
And you're not really sure why. Like, is it relation to fear or concern, or just like is that something you've unpacked?
I have tried to think about it, and I think that they're just. It was so easy for me to just sit and stay comfortable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no reason, I guess.
Okay.
There was no reason to take things further. Maybe specifically with the arts, I was grounded enough to know that like this is just like child play, like fun,
right?
Sure. Because I will say, and I mentioned building being a huge aspect, or a huge part of my life. I did take 4 years of a really good shop program that we had in high school, and I knew that I didn't want to go to college, so it was the SAT, ACT thing. I'm like, there's no way I could sit in a class and take a 4-hour test. So my dad worked right down the street in Afton here from the Carpenters Union apprenticeship program, and he brought some information home, and I'm like, hey, I'll make money right off the bat. I'll get to work full time. And I am a huge advocate for the trades. Still today, college is not the only decision. I knew it wasn't the decision for me. And I still feel confident with that. And though building and specifically the Carpenters Union hasn't always been my main focus, those skills and abilities that I've learned there, I've taken with me. A lot like all these other things that I'll get into, but I've taken those skills specifically with me, those very practical skills, and I've been able to use them through my entire life to at least for my supplication and just provide the needs for me and my family. Well, so super grateful for that.
I think what's interesting about 2 Timothy's story is that there's now. Correct me if I'm wrong, okay, and I might be wrong, but like there's no trauma. And by that I mean there's not like this huge motivating, like he was content. And I think there's a lot of people in this world who can benefit just from Tim's story, right? Just off of that. Like they're content. Like I have a friend that I have been working on for years trying to bring him to learn, like to understand and to love the Lord. And he's not opposed to it, but he's content. Mm-hmm. But what's really interesting, I think, about your story is there's eventually going to become a discontent with being content. And I think that's a lot of times when we hear testimonies and we have them, there's trauma, there's chaos, there's tyranny. There's something. But sometimes one of the greatest killers can just be simply, I was content, I'm average, I was good.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. No, that's actually a really good point. I just started watching that new series on Moses on Netflix.
Oh, yes.
And they actually make that point because they're talking about him and his life specifically. And they say that he was an example of that, of being so overly saturated with, I won't even call it contentment, because I feel like contentment would breed like a satisfaction.
Sure.
But there was just something else that he needed. Like, it was almost a death.
Right.
Death for him. So he had to go and, pursue life or stand up for justice, I guess.
It's the recognition of there's a void. Everybody always has a void. They call, I can't remember who first coined the phrase, but like a God-shaped hole. And like that hole within us is different. Sometimes it's a square or a triangle. And so, but I think it's important in your story to identify, like, you have a more common hole in your life than some people may think, because we all look at, like I said, everybody wants to know the story about, like, and I know we're going to get into some of your what changed and but everybody wants those, I was born into chaos and I rose from the ashes like a phoenix, and you're like, nah, my mom and dad were cool. Yeah. I liked them. School was all right. I played football. And it was just kind of, but it's almost like you said, there's a slow death in that is like, if you don't get out of that, you're stuck into this routine that, like my friend is, he's a little older than me, in his 40s now. Like he's content with being content, and he doesn't. And there's danger in that. So continue, man.
Yeah. There can be, and the one more thing I'll say on all that is that there can be, but there's nothing wrong with doing anything, with not doing something spectacular.
Right.
in my opinion, it's the details of your life that matter, and taking time to even as the simple accountant who goes to work in the same town that he grew up in. There's extra things. There's volunteer efforts. There's hobbies and skills that you can get into. It gives you a greater appreciation for everything. It will help define gratitude for you and just make a fuller life, which in my experience not only benefits you, but people see that.
Right.
It's part of the spirit and the light of God. I feel like in you that you acknowledging things like that. It has an effect on you and others. And good segue, because I'll just get into right now. After I graduated high school, I'm working full time with a carpenters union. I got into I had an experience one Christmas. My mom got me a book, The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great theological masterpieces we've discussed.
Wait, is that Tom Hanks?
In the movie.
In the movie.
The movie, yeah. Sorry, I don't read. As we know, we don't read the books. We just watch the movies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yes. So Da Vinci Code,
provocative story about Jesus having supposedly a bloodline.
Right.
But anyway, I will say that one thing that Dan Brown does. I will say that one thing that Dan Brown does is he does a good job, because I've read a few other of his books. His literature is saturated with information and history, and I decided for whatever reason to start reading that book that Christmas Day, and it just, my mind, I have been blessed with this imagination, and it just exploded that day. I learned how good I was at being able to create a setting. I could see these characters. Things were vivid. The details of some of the descriptions and stuff like that. It opened me up to this world of just like wonder and interest, and I was hooked. And I wanted more of that.
Do you know why? Like, why that book? Like, why that book over all the other hundreds of books that have been placed before you?
Yeah, and to be fair, there were moments younger where I would actually pick up the book report book and read a bit.
Yeah.
And there was again those flares, but it never clicked. It wasn't my time. But when it came to me finally accepting that and really like stepping into, wow, like I get this.
Right.
I think that that's part, and another big thing I like to stress when I talk with the youth is that is who I am. That's what I was created to be. I believe that's part of me, and that was me experiencing the fullness of what God created me to be. Yeah. And it's life, and it feels so good, and it's just right.
That's why the arts speak to you, because there's a creativity or creative freedom in, like you said, like I read books, and I don't even read fiction books. I only read, like nonfiction, because I'm a man of facts, and so, but in all seriousness, I love like history books. I don't have the same imagination you do. Like, like I can read a fiction book and I'll just be like, oh, like Joe's such an annoying character. Next page, and you'll be like, oh man, Joe, let me give Joe a backstory. Like you dive into it. So that's interesting.
Well, and not only that, but it has an effect on other aspects of my life. Like specifically, I read books and I watch movies, and I feel like I can see the hand of God in that.
Sure, yeah.
I feel like I can see, the blessing of God in, from the creators that influence the creators.
Yeah.
I feel like God is speaking to everyone, and He's working through everything. And in my experience, I can see the details of that. Where maybe even, the atheistic creator didn't or doesn't.
Right.
But there's, every soul is calling for their creator. I think. There's a longing there.
Sure.
Well, there's something to be said about, God created this universe. God created the, like we did a podcast on the moral law, right? And one of the things that apologists will argue is that everyone has access to God's moral law, right? They just don't understand where it's coming from. And then because of that, that's how easy it is to pervert it, because they're not recognizing where it's coming from. But it kind of goes back to that saying, all truth is God's truth, right? Like there is a truth, and if you hit the truth, you know it came from God. All good things come from God, right? So where an atheist may not ascribe a good thing to God, we know that that good thing came from God. Right. So I think there's something to be said there. Just people will hit on that vein, and then what they'll do is they'll assume it's because they were talented. They'll assume that it's because they were brilliant.
Right.
But in reality, they're striking true with something about who God is and how God created the universe.
Right. It's that philosophical argument for the existence of God, that like, why is something beautiful?
Yeah.
Right. And like he recognizes the beauty even in the Da Vinci Code. Not saying not knocking the book, but I'm saying like there's a certain sense of like you can see God's hand apparent, especially in the arts, I would say, but in all things, you see where God is moving and working, especially from a creative creator. You know what I mean? Like this, we have creativity because we are made in the image of God. So not to cut you off, but continue, man. Yeah.
No, and the one other thing I'll say about that is, I just lost it. Let me move on. But yeah, no, that's all good stuff. So anyway, I had this this explosion of creativity and imagination that sparked, which led to some other things that I had been pondering, but really started to take a deeper dive into. I was interested at the time in health and fitness, which maybe came from my sporting background. So I took that a little bit further and got interested in anatomy, and I went through an EMT course and became a registered EMT. I was doing a little bit of drinking in those days. And specifically, alcohol has played quite a role in my life. It started out with fun and games in high school, and then after high school, hey, you turn 21. And so, there's the bar scene and more parties, and I ended up getting arrested for a DUI, and you can't drive an ambulance with a record like that.
No.
So
I thought you could say you can't drive an ambulance drunk. I was like, no, probably not. You're probably right, man. Well, it's because you were young and you had the money, because you were working a good job.
yeah,
Yeah, sure, that happens, man. Yeah.
yeah. So fascinating experience. That door was shut, right?
Right.
I was wanting to take that to do the fireman thing, and I was like, maybe I'll get out of the union and I'll do this new thing. And door was shut. But the carpenters didn't mind, so I still had that.
Jesus is always a man of second chances.
That's right.
That's right.
I got a postcard one day about this talent agency looking for kids for like their new boutique, running some classes. So I was like, well, I like being the center of attention. I enjoy movies and reading and stuff like that. Yeah. So hey, let's go. Simple like that. I don't know. I was like, it was like I was beginning to act on impulses.
Sure.
Which I think is an interesting point too. And so I did, and I took these classes, and I got interested in that, and that led to more classes, and then I actually signed with a local agency here, and started doing some local theater and auditioning for some of the video stuff, and I really, really enjoyed it. I was coming to the end of my apprenticeship program, which they're about a 4-year program. You work full time, and then there's some classroom hours where I'd go back to this facility every now and then. And I felt this call of like the wild, we'll say. The adventure in me, the adventure in me was calling. You read these books and hear these stories about these kids who leave home and go out and have all these experiences, and I wanted that.
What is that book, Into the Wild? Is that the guy who goes and dies in Alaska?
Oh yeah,
yes. Is that
he was too ambitious.
Yeah, he was a little too ambitious. Yeah, a little too. But you kind of had that hair, right?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely the same thing.
This is the discontentment with content. You're ready to do something new.
Yeah,
it's that coming of age. It's
Yeah.
about shedding the old and coming into something new.
Yeah. So, and I was on the fringes of I was 24 years old, still living with mom and dad. But it worked out well because one thing I'll stress, if you decide on, that this might be for you or your kids, I had some money saved up. I had quite a bit saved up, 10 or 15 grand. And I was like, hey, I got the acting. I got this journeymanship, which allowed me to work anywhere in the country. Sure. Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Not Alaska. He's going to California.
No,
Yeah.
I'm going to the beach. Yeah. I did some very rough research on like where I'd stay and kind of how the city was laid out and formatted.
Yeah. How did you move from here to there? How did that?
I knew no one. I had no connections. I was just like, well, I again, going back to money, I was pretty good with budgeting and keeping an eye on finances and what would go out. And so I knew that I would have some time to kind of figure things out.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So we got my dad and I were going to drive out there. I loaded all my stuff up. We got in the truck. And I will say the moment we started to leave the driveway, I said, this was a mistake. I think it was that very comfortable kid figuring out that like, oh no, like here is the doors just open to the abyss of like of opportunity and just awe of the bigness that is the West.
Right. You wanted to ride the roller coaster and you finally got on it and you made it to the top and you're like, oh, never mind, I want to get off.
That's exactly what it felt like. Yeah.
But it was only in your parents' driveway.
So the whole trip there, and we're going through all this beautiful, country going west, and the whole trip there, I was just like, how can I get back and not look like such a fool, for all of this? But slowly but surely, one little bit at a time, I began to figure things out. I did take some time and kind of explored the city when I got there. Los Angeles is very poor and dirty predominantly. It has its
what a
charm.
selling point. What a selling point.
It has its hipster charm. And I did totally enjoy my time there. Specifically because of who I vaguely knew was me. I was surrounded in a place and with people that had the same kind of mind and mentality. Sure. A very creative, a very passionate, and all that was going on around me. Right. So it filled me and fed me so much. And I think along with God, I think it helped me to persevere and carry on.
Sure.
Because I had that extra push, camaraderie.
Sure.
I joined an acting class. I think the big thing that really strengthened my faith and really made me pursue a deeper understanding of my faith was the money started to dwindle. And I had to figure something out. Sure. And then I had that moment of, I think at the time specifically, the acting was starting to pick up these classes, which I mentioned because they had such an impact on my life of, again, the camaraderie and these kids that I was meeting, and it really opened me up to the craft and the art. But the classes were at night, and with the union, we would start super early because of the cliche LA traffic, which is true.
It's not cliche. I'm gonna say it is definitely not
so
cliche.
So we would start super early, and then I would have to stay up super late, and I was sleeping like 4 hours a night. Which I was ambitious, but like sure. You need rest.
He was going for a lot of zombie roles, out there, like just so walk slow, yeah.
So anyway, I kind of got to the point of like, I had to figure something out with work and supplementing my income. So I got some great advice from a pastor that my old pastor that I stayed in touch with here, and he said, make the choice that takes the most faith. And the choice that I was dealing with was, I had met this local designer who did sets and stage work, and it was going to be a huge pay cut, but I would be completely flexible. And so I kind of broke down and I was like, "Is this going to work?" And I didn't hear anything. There was no aha all moment for me, but I kept going. I feel like I was going about it responsible, and I was inviting the Lord into, this thing that I felt called and made to be. So like we were talking earlier, I think this was the point that I wanted to make, was that I was learning who I was, and I wasn't just keeping that to myself. I was wanting that to be refracted, I think is the word, through God and his understanding, his morality, his purpose. So I was because you can have good gifts that are used in a wrong way.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
My example is Adolf Hitler was a great public speaker.
Right. You ain't
He
wrong.
could have been an inspiration.
That's right. Yeah.
No.
He was just in the wrong way.
Just inspired the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Inspired the wrong thing. That's right. Yeah.
So anyway, I was taking these things and inviting the Lord in, and because of that, and again, that motto of do the one that makes the most make the choice that takes the most faith, do that boldly, and do it responsibly, even though you're taking a chance, but with sincerity. I just have not gone wrong in my life.
Yeah.
And it worked out. I got a chance to work on some incredible things when it came to the acting and movies and TV shows and big studio sets. And commercials and music videos and it was just, I was having a blast, and I was still doing a lot of drinking, for the most part alone, which was probably for the best anyway, because I will say that though I did not get involved in the party scene there, if losing focus on what you're there to do could go very badly. So I luckily did not get caught up in anything like that.
Do you feel? Yeah, I was gonna say. Do you feel like it increased, stayed the same? Like your drinking? Like, did it increase, stay the same? Like,
no,
it was. What do you think motivated that?
It definitely increased.
It did.
Yeah. It increased and it increased, I think, because of the reasons why. So, high school, it was for fun.
Right.
Now it was to relieve stress because I was bored, because I was lonely.
Sure.
There was just a ton more examples of reasons why. So it was becoming a god.
Sure.
Really.
Well, that's why
me.
I asked it because it's funny, like. No one sets out to have a drinking problem.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's interesting how, like, just in your story, not to slam. Please don't see this as a slam, but like, it's interesting to see how contentment can slowly drain you. You know what I mean? Like.
Oh yeah.
Like so. You start out, you drink and I'm not saying drinking is the crux of your story, but I think it parallels your story. Like, you start out, you drink because everybody's doing it, it's kind of fun. Well, that's what you know. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes almost a coping strategy as you continue through your life. And now you're on your own, and the only thing you really know at this point is, well, I guess I could just go ahead and have a drink.
Yeah. Well, or I could say a few prayers, read a bit of scripture, and also have a few drinks. So it was like...
That's the dynamic that I think I'm most curious about too. Because as we've been discussing that, you grew up Lutheran, so you're in the church. You start experimenting with drinking in high school. You turn 21, so you start going to bars. You go out, but the whole time you're also building a responsible life for yourself.
Right.
And so you move out to Los Angeles. And you made comments about, like, having a pastor out there that was advising you, to take the step that required the most faith.
Right.
But at that same time, you're still drinking. You're still in all of that. Was that a was that a conflict for you? Or did you feel like all of these things were mutually acceptable?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And how I can look back on my story now is a refining process. And I think this is true for everybody, but I know for myself, there were things that I was just blind to. And alcohol was one of those things. I think for the most part because it wasn't having too much of an effect on anybody else but me.
Yeah.
Which maybe I tried to justify it as being okay.
And you were still functioning.
And I was still very high functioning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I was still, living a pretty responsible life.
Yeah, because I can see your question, Timothy, First Timothy. I can see, because I think there is. I find that interesting too, because usually in people's stories, the one increases and the other decreases. Like my faith in God was tanking as I was drinking, but yours is like, nah, they're kind of going the same way. But I think it's probably because. I don't want to jump through to forward in your story, but I think it's you probably just were like, I don't have a problem, I'm fine. Like,
yeah. There were moments when I think that
you'd say, uh-oh.
I'd say, yeah, maybe I should keep an eye on this. But those like anything, maybe I should exercise a little bit more.
Right.
But then I'll be all right.
I've been saying that for 10 years, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I was excelling at multiple aspects of my life, just including the drinking.
Yeah. I was excelling in life and drinking.
And still very high and still functioning. And I was continuing to do a bunch of things out there. A few other things. I was experiencing the natural beauty of that area, and I would do road trips, and see the deserts and the mountains. And the oceans, and there's so much this country has to offer, and these trips I would do these. I went on a few road trips with my sister specifically, and just what it did for our camaraderie and relationship, and what it opened this passionate kid up to of just the natural beauty of things, and we just have that all here. I went to Italy and got to explore, even a little bit further abroad. Again, the people that I would meet there and the conversations that I would have, people were they were very open, and they were sincere. And I will say, they were interested in what I had to say when it came to my relationship with God. Mm-hmm. I had some very interesting conversations, and these conversations would happen one-on-one for the most part. I think there's something to say about a group mentality, which we hear a lot about. Sure. The entertainment industry or a very modern leftish community in general. Sure. But you get somebody one-on-one, and people are interested and curious in these foundational things that that God provides.
Yeah, because we're all the same.
The conversation they'll have with you in person is not the same thing they'll drop in a comment on a social media video. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the questions they'll ask in person are not the same they'll ask online. Because online they've got face to say, but on a conversation, no one's taking notes. You know what I mean? Right. And so you can be more frank and more honest. So yeah, that's and I wonder if just like your situation in life allowed you to have those conversations even more freely, just because, like you said, you kind of, it seems almost like Pauline in the aspect of like, I can kind of just put me in a group and I'll figure a way to fit in, and so I wonder, did you feel like you fit in LA and in all in those areas?
Yes, and I never really made it a point. I never made it a point to try, but I like to think that the attractiveness that is me, not just the physical attractiveness, but like the attractive.
He's perfect for this podcast.
right.
That's right. The humility of this man. Yes.
You know what? Let's take a break here. Actually, I brought you guys something. Just to remember the situation.
Please, yes.
These are signed headshots.
Signed headshots.
I put a little comment on there for you both to enjoy.
I'm gonna put this in my office, dude.
Just
No joke.
$5 each when you guys get a chance.
Right. Yeah.
That's fine.
I love it. I love it. Look at it.
What were we talking?
I don't know, but that's amazing. That may be the best thing a guest has ever brought us.
let me see if I can bring us in. So like through your life, okay, you start out and you're kind of content, and then like it sounds like when you went off to LA, that's like the first moment that you've really feel like you've challenged yourself, right? Because now you're afraid of what could happen. You're concerned, did I make the right decision? Did I get out of here? And then when you get out there, you really feel like God is kind of drawing out the desires that he's put in your heart. Mm-hmm. And he's helping you like kind of pursue some of those things. At least that's what I've been taking from this story, right? Even with some of the imperfections that are happening in your life, God is saying like, hey, let's
He was
pursue this
even
in faith.
able to use those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's continuing to have a hand in kind of what's going on. So now we're in LA, we're meeting some really interesting people, we're doing some really cool stuff, we're getting to travel across the world, we're having some really great conversations. Mm-hmm. And all the while there's some other things that are going on that maybe you're starting to excel in some of the wrong areas as well with the drinking and getting to a place where that maybe is a problem or is a problem. So, so where does that take us? Where does that get us to?
Yeah. Well, I was getting older as well. I was probably 27 or 28 at the time, and the family man in me was calling. Mm-hmm. So that was about the time that I met who is now my wife through a mutual friend. Well, it was her cousin, a buddy of mine, and we met on a snowboard trip on one of my on this trip up to Canada, and she lived in Seattle, and we stopped by there because it was family for him, and he didn't get a chance to see them too often. So I met her, and we dated long distance for a while, and I had done some really cool things there, and I was satisfied with my experience in Los Angeles. She was a small town girl, and wasn't ready for the LA lifestyle. Sure. So I decided to make another move up that way. Mm-hmm. And so I make it to Seattle, and this was like my own personal renovation. Mm-hmm. I feel like it started with, well, I'll give an example from each of the topics. I have this broken down into faith, family, work, and acting, and kind of what happened in each of these places with those things. So with my faith, my wife was very new to the faith. I was coming from a very conservative Lutheran background, and it was like it's all just modern contemporary worship up there, and that was just very uncomfortable for me. So I was trying to get used to that. Their ideas on communion and baptism, were a huge thing. We had got pregnant almost immediately when I had gotten up there. So, speaking of baptism, then, we have the illegitimate, marriage and the children, and what are we going to do about baptism? We're moving around a bunch because we didn't have this place. I was even in a trailer behind my in-laws' house for a while. The acting didn't work out like I was hoping. Everything had gotten very digitally based, and I was able to, kind of stay in touch and still apply for projects online. I'd record these videos and send them in. Well, that was kind of like, that just was not working out like I thought. So I was mad. I was frustrated, confused. It was everybody else's fault. How do I deal with all this? Well, I got my old friend Liquor still to, to
right.
get me through.
Got to excel in drinking some more. That's right.
Yeah.
So, the quantity went up and the quality went down. So that's a good.
Wait,
that's a good sign.
The liquor
Of
went
the
down.
liquor.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We're talking stags now.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
So Francis and I had gotten in an argument, and I drove off again, and went to a few bars after already probably drinking quite a bit throughout the day, and got arrested for another DUI. My girlfriend Francis and 3-month-old baby have to come and pick me up from jail. Sometimes it felt like work. I was there. There enough. And I was offered this deferred prosecution option, which allowed me to go to rehab and AA to surpass some jail time. So thankfully nobody was hurt.
Right.
With all these shenanigans, but there were some repercussions on my own actions that I had to get into, and I did what I had to do, but there was definitely not that word sincerity on my part to want to get to do all of this. But slowly and surely, as I did my best to kind of pay attention and jump through the hoops, and the programs, it was regimented pretty well to where you almost have to take it seriously.
Right.
I started to realize that maybe it was my fault. Maybe some of these things were my responsibility.
Sure.
And I just remember starting to be flooded with the sense of blessing. I was able to just see the abundance that was my life, in details that I wasn't even noticing before, and I believe that has something to do with there was a clarity, not just a moment of clarity, but like a whole clarifying change of my life.
Sure.
Was going on.
What do you think? Like, what drove that? Like, where did the clarity come from? So it's interesting because there are in your story, there are these epiphany moments. Mm-hmm. So you read all sorts of books growing up, debatable whether you read them or not, but you read them, and then the Da Vinci Code is a moment of clarity that's wow, I have a God-given talent to be able to creatively imagine, and that's where I connect with God, in the creative. And now here's another moment of clarity that's okay, I have been abundantly blessed. What do you think? What was driving those shifts? What was motivating?
Well, again, throughout this whole story, there were many times where I could have met my demise and perished super easily.
Sure.
I had a bunch of friends that were given maybe one or half the chances, or even one chance of the things that I did, mm-hmm. And God has I come to the conclusion that God He has a purpose for me, mm-hmm. that is not yet fulfilled, and mm-hmm. I think to fully use that purpose, or to be able to use it in its fullness, I'd say, is to show me the abundance that is my life, that is a relationship with Him. And that's what He was doing. He had held on to me through all of this, and in my own to defend myself, I would eventually take responsibility for these things. So, it was I was mad and frustrated and aggravated. I would have my moments of self-pity, but then I would turn to God in repentance.
Sure.
So I was not letting go of Him. And it would things began to click for me of see the abundance that I have for you. Stop doing this thing. You're hurting yourself. Mm-hmm. There's that comment today of, well, if I'm not hurting anybody, it's fine, right?
Right.
And I would say no, because you're not living to your maximum potential, and not doing that is you're hurting everybody else. Mm-hmm. Right. Because who knows what kind of effect that you can have on others, on society, on any cause out there. If you're comatosing yourself, or mm-hmm. or not getting out there, or too shy, or too afraid to make a change. So there is something wrong with if it's not hurting anybody and you're not striving for that maximum potential that could be you. And I think, my sobriety was just God showing me that, because I would be lying if I didn't say that. Well, my energy level may be the same.
Sure.
But the sincerity, the sincerity that I feel for things, the depth that I have for things did change. The meaning that I had. I was running out of excuses to go anywhere else but to God as my main resource.
Well, I think I was going to say, one thing that really strikes me here in this story is, like, we keep going back to, like, contentment, average, that kind of thing. Like, here's what changed was being blessed abundantly there's nothing, I mean, let's thank God. That's what changed, though, is the gratitude. You know what I mean? Like, the realization that you're blessed changes what you do with your blessings. So growing up, you're content. Yeah, I got good parents. I got, like I said, like there was nothing wrong with there was no, and I'm not to downplay. I'm sure there's trauma in everybody's life. Okay. But like, there was no major, like, my parents died in a fiery car wreck and I forsake God. Like, you've kind of always been with God, but the difference here is you've always been with God, but now you recognize it's always been God.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And that's the scales that when we are living lives of content, like that's what I would say even to my friend is like and he's a very successful guy. Like, I always tell him, like, like, your success is not you. Like, it's God has given you, like you said, that's the frustrating part I feel in you, in my, situation too, is when I see people who aren't living into the fullness of what God has for them.
Yeah.
And I'd say frustrating in a way, like, you want to motivate them. They're like, oh, but you could change the world, but you're content to sit here in this bubble. And so I think that's really what's happening in your story here, is that, like, yeah, while you excelled at drinking, that brought a moment of clarity that also reminded you that God has been with you. And you never forgot this. You've always knew God was there, but you just never saw
not in its fullness.
Right.
Yeah.
How vividly God has been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah.
So my eyes were becoming even more so open, and my ears and my faith. I will say that where liquor has been such a stumbling block in my life, I was very functional even though before so, and still I would call myself a man of God who understood and stood up for his truths. It was so much clearer, and I advanced so much more and was able to go so much deeper in my relationship with God. And contemporary worship did that as well, where it opened up what I'd call my heart brain of just it became more personal. More personal. Of a relationship.
So I think that's a major differential, is understanding a personal relationship with God and also knowing about God or who God is. So like as you're discussing that, like, through the history of your life, you always knew God was there. You didn't consistently go to him, but you did when you felt like you needed to. You felt like you could stand up for his truth. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, like moment after moment, I'm hearing conversations of not submitting to him. Mm-hmm. Right. So like, whether it was, the drinking and like starting by breaking the law with it by doing it underage. And then, and then now we've got the premarital sex, and we've got, the child outside of wedlock and how we're dealing with that. And like, as we kind of move through that, like, do you feel like you were submitted to God before you had to have this ultimatum? Or do you feel like it was like you got to a point where this forced you to kind of confront some of these things through this program and kind of see and start to get some perspective on it, that's what allowed you to begin to submit your life to him? Or do you look back at that and think, Well, I'm not sure. Like, how do you was there ever a point where you look back at that and reconciled any of those,
Yeah.
kind of reconciled those things?
Well, I almost wonder if I wonder how strong I am sometimes, because I think if maybe I would have had that rougher upbringing,
Sure.
maybe I wouldn't have had the endurance to if I would have been, if all of these things would have rushed at me at once, would I have been able to persevere? And I think God, knowing me, knew that I could only take what I could as I could.
Mm-hmm.
So, these experiences and trials that I had, as if I was willing to admit that I was wrong and turn to God in repentance and seek His insight, I could climb the rope to become closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that rope was tied at baptism,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's just my journey of becoming closer. So I think that relationship was sincere and was always there, but I'm at the point today to where that relationship is maybe eternally. It will go as far as you want it to go.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Its depth is eternal.
Yeah.
And you can, as long as you're willing to confront a situation, a vice, an addiction in your life, He promises that there's strength in Him to overcome, and truly, truly, the rewards far outweigh the struggle, which it will take, and the suffering
Mm-hmm.
that you will experience, and it is well worth it.
Well, I think it's interesting too, like you said, 1 Timothy to 2 Timothy. I'm just going to keep going, guys. But I think it's interesting because I said literally something to that extent to my son the other day. Is he was in an argument with this kid, and they were going back and forth, and I was like, dude, don't even give him, like, stop giving it life. Like, stop giving that argument life. Like, just if he wants to be that way, let him be that way. And then I said, and like, just give it to the Lord. And I'm like, and I said this, and now I know I shouldn't probably said this. I'm like, you're a Christian, man. Like, just give it to God. Now I know that's a cop out, but what I was trying to say is, like, be different.
Yeah.
And he said, well, he's a Christian too. And then I sat back and I thought to myself, and it's funny you say that, because literally we had the same conversation. I said, well, there's a difference between knowing the Lord and knowing the Lord.
Right.
And I said, a lot of people know the Lord, but you know the Lord. I said,
Right.
you have a relationship with Him, and that means that you listen to Him and you follow Him, even if your friend's not doing it, even if others are, And so I think that that's interesting, because I think one thing that I see a lot of people, and it's not just because you were raised Lutheran or Catholic or Protestant or in the Church of God, but one thing I do think is a lot of people know the Lord, and they know I was one of them, right? I knew a ton about the Lord. Like, I studied Him, even though I didn't even believe in Him. I read philosophers who did, so it's like I knew a lot about the Lord, but I did not know the Lord. And I think when you begin to, like you said, I like that idea of climbing a rope. I could never climb a rope because I was always like the big kid, and I could never climb that rope. So
Yeah.
mine's probably more of a ladder.
It could be a ladder.
I'm more of a ladder guy, more of a Jacob's ladder kind of guy. But there's a truth to that. Like, God is calling you, like, up, and we have the choice to continue to climb that ladder to grow closer to Him. And as we grow closer to Him, things change, perspective changes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
even what you see. And so I think that's interesting in your story. Like I said, he has an interesting story in the aspect of there was never a falling out with God. There was more a falling in with God. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
And as well, like, through all of those things, you kind of keep mentioning there's a refining that continually
right.
is happening. And so for some people, certain aspects of sanctification are going to occur sooner than for others.
Right.
And so it's not a question of salvation. It's a question of how quickly is God getting us where He wants us.
Right.
Because we have to trust the potter's hands, right?
Right.
Like, He knows how long we need to be on the wheel.
Yeah.
He knows how long we need to be shaped and to be maneuvered to be that vessel that He needs us to be. So, so from this point, when we get to this place where we're now confronting these things, we now have a different level of gratitude, and this relationship is gone deeper and you've fallen even more into Christ. Where does that take us?
Well, my convictions, and they had grown along the way as well. But sobriety was just, it was such a there was such a substantial jump in so many things from gratitude to my convictions, and that covered everything from how I was running my relationship with Francis, even to the acting and what kind of projects what kind of stories I wanted to tell, what kind of roles I wanted to play.
Sounds a lot like Warren, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like Warren did the same thing. Like he started to put, like, for lack of a better word, like Christian limits. Like, I'm going to sing these songs, but I'm not going to sing these songs because those don't align with, even if they're secular songs, they don't align with what God would, objectifying women or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Her and I, and noting Carly's message a few weeks ago, I had not been performing as a man like that was worthy of her hand anyway. So as I showed that I was, stepping into more responsibility and taking time for her like a husband should, we ended up getting we had our second kid. We ended up getting married, bought a house. Things really started to pick up in Seattle. There were some things that she was confronting, some other ambitions that I wanted to get into with real estate specifically, and the market, out west is just so high. So we started to throw around this idea of moving back here to Missouri, which, this would be the third cross-country trip, and with two kids. And then she ended up getting pregnant a few months before we ended up making the trip. But we still felt called and convicted about that, so we made the trip here back to Missouri, and through AA was able to found Southside, and have been here ever since for almost a year now. Getting back to your point, Tim, I look at my life and situations and work and everything. How can I better trust God in this? How can I execute this in a way that is pleasing to Him, and that He is calling me to? Because He's obviously shed abundant grace and mercy into my life, because He obviously has predestined me for good works to do. So I am going to not think about things, which is how I did before I left Missouri, of the very generic way of you get a job and you work and then you retire and go to the Lake of the Ozarks every
Right.
No, I'm going to push the boundaries of, like, how much money do we need each month so that I can be about the Lord's work in my life. With all of this experience that I've had, I've been able to have some incredible conversations with family and friends, and things that they're struggling with, because everybody was seeing the things that were happening to me, the good things,
right,
and the chances that I was willing to take, and the respectable things of admitting that there was a problem in my life and taking responsibility to capitalize on that, and my relationship with the Lord, and how much I truly give it all to God, because He had plenty of chances to pick and choose someone else, but He's decided to use me for all of this. So when it comes to my family, I sit down and have the conversations instead of getting frustrated with my wife. I take time for the kids and want to be that role model for them of practice what He preaches, practice what I want what I want them to see in my own life, and being that good example for them. I mentioned wanting to keep myself flexible so I could be more and more about the word, about the Lord's work in my life. And just some last thoughts I would just say is reinvention has been a huge part in my life and story of taking things that I was really excited about initially. And as time goes by and things change, you might have to. You obviously had something good there. It just may need to be tweaked or critiqued. You don't have to give it up, but it may look differently. Mm-hmm. And being willing to try that, figuring out who you are and what you're made to do, and again giving that to God so that He can show you how it should be used in a way that would produce righteousness.
That's a point that I think even people who don't believe in God will agree with you, right? Mm-hmm. Figure out what you're supposed to do. Find a purpose, whether they believe there's an intrinsic purpose or not. They know you live life better if you have a purpose, right? But when we say that, when we start talking about finding that purpose, I think it's also important to remember to, like, we don't do that in a vacuum. We don't do that inside ourselves. We do that in the Scripture. We do that in the Word of God. And any of those desires, any of those things have to align with God. Like, God didn't create you contrary to His Word, right? I think I've told that story before about, like my brother-in-law getting mad at something and yelling and blowing up and saying, well, that's just who I am.
Right.
My response, internally was, well, God didn't make you a jerk,
Right.
And I think that's something we have to continue to remind ourselves as we pursue those things, right? It's like anything that God is driving me towards is going to align with His Word.
Well, and I think what's interesting too is like it's as you say this, it's kind of and now honestly we try to keep these organic and authentic in the aspect of we don't rehearse these things, but I think it's really interesting how you basically have redefined your definition of contentment. And like his contentment before was just like life was good, but now his contentment is whatever God says is good, right? So like I may have to tweak, I may have to critique, I may have to change things about me, about my life, even about the things, but I'm content to do it because I find my contentment now in what God says. And not that God hasn't been, but like His purpose, His, you know what I mean? Like all of those things. And so I think that's kind of interesting to see just in your story, how contentment has been redefined from the world's definition of contentment to God's definition of contentment, which is I'm willing to be flexible. I'm willing to do things differently for the sake of growing the kingdom of God. I think that's it's kind of funny, right?
And I think the more you do that too, the quicker the change can come.
Right.
Because I think the process now, so I'm more willing to get right to the solution.
Right.
Which is a really exciting thing as well.
Right, and I think that's the other thing too. Like so now, and this is just again, this is what a perfectly God. He just used the word excitement. Like when you find contentment in God, things become energizing. You don't have a desire to pack up and move to LA. Now I'm not saying you won't. I mean, God may call you there, but you see what I'm saying? Like the energy you're drawing from contentment now comes from God. It doesn't come from a discontent with contentment that's like, oh, life is just mundane. I'm slowly dying. I need to do something. Now you're like, God, what do you want me to do? Because I know that's where I'm going to find fulfillment. I'm going to find energy. I'm going to find those things. Yeah.
And I'm able to trust that more now, but there is still a temptation, and it was definitely a temptation early on of fear and worry and concern, and there will be struggle and there will be suffering. That is going to be inevitable, but maybe that's what James means when he talks about to count it all joy, brothers.
Yeah.
Right.
Because now I know when that suffering or when the schedule gets crazy, I know the Lord's got something going on, and I can trust, again, that word trust, which I did not use a lot in my relationship with God early on. But that is if there's one word I can define in my relationship with God these days, it's trust. I will trust in you and your ways and how you want things to go. And it's just helped me in every single aspect of my life. Marriage is one of the hardest things I've ever done. We still have arguments, but it was such a stumbling block for me early on, just our relationship in general. And it's so much easier for me now to, to go about it in a way responsible, and God-like responsible, admitting I'm wrong, seeing my own mistake, being patient. Even if I think I am, in the right, it's all the more my responsibility to bite my tongue and to just, let it be.
Sure, to love your wife. Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, I think that's like, what he's referring to is, and we talked about this in the last episode, is like, what Carly had said is, we talk about submitting to your wives, submit to your husbands. And in the world today, like, that's seen as a bad thing, but that's not a bad thing. And what Carly said is like, husbands, you need to be worthy of submitting too. You need to live a life that is God honoring. And I think that's maybe the change in your life has been, as Tim was saying, okay, you've always known God, but now you're saying, I only want your will. Not my will be done, but your will be done. And I think that's the shift, because here's the thing. Like, there's a lot of people who are content with their lives. There's a lot of people who are productive. As you said, I was an alcoholic, but I was functioning, like I high functioning. And there's a lot of people out there who maybe aren't struggling with alcohol, but maybe it's something else, or maybe they're just in that contentment rut, and they're looking and they're saying like, I don't like, what could be better than this? And your story is God. Like, God could be so much better than this. And like, if you trust, if you lean into that changes things. And I think that's a powerful story for a lot of people, because there's a lot of people who are happy with their lives, but it's simultaneously saying, is this it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna call this out real quick too, because I think this has been a really good conversation, and you shared some things about kind of where you are now, and I just want to point out some things that people wouldn't know otherwise. You and I had a conversation not too long ago where we went and sat down, had coffee, talked about doing this, and talking about some things, and you had mentioned something to me about like setting aside like time and money and effort as a way to tithe to God by doing things for people.
Oh yeah.
Right? And I thought, I was like, hey, that's a really great thing to say, right? For one, but like Brandon and I, when we got here this morning, we were in here in this in this room, and kind of peel back the curtain a little bit. We were recording our last episode.
Don't tell him that. Don't tell him that. No.
Yeah, we record some of these at the same time, and then we change shirts so that you don't know that it's the same.
Let's do a little switcheroo on him.
And we heard some rattling outside, and we thought that it was the kids. We thought the kids had gotten into something,
but we didn't care enough to go check on them. So.
Right. Turned out you took time out of your schedule, came up to the church, and you were working in the church, like hanging lights. This isn't the first time I've seen you in here doing this. And like doing things here around the church, volunteering your time and your effort to further the kingdom of God. And you didn't know we were here to tell on you about that, kind of thing. And then additionally, volunteering to come speak to the youth group. You came in and spoke to the youth group not that long ago too. So like, it's great to see that, your money is where your mouth is, so to speak. Yeah. Like, it's evident to anybody that spends any time with you, and I've only spent a little bit of time with you personally. Brandon may be able to test further, but like some of these things you've talked about, some of these things that you say, like, this is the ideal of what I'm shooting for with God. Anyone that spends time with you is going to see that. And we are seeing that. And that's a big reason why we were, pleased to have you come in and share some of this story with anybody that will listen.
Right.
All six of our,
No, there'll be at least 12. I'm gonna have the family to watch.
There you go.
That's right.
Well, the guest episodes usually do better because the guest tells people to watch it.
Then they hear those drum jokes and they're like, we won't be back for the next episode.
But before we close up, I'd love to give you an opportunity, just kind of the last opportunity, maybe get a final word in here of like, is there any parting thing? And if not, that's fine too. Is there any parting things that you want to leave, or anything that you didn't mention that you're like, you know what, let's touch on this for a second, or any messages that you would leave this conversation with?
I think just one, and it'd be right off of what you said, and that's, do not just be hearers of the word, but doers.
Yeah.
I just can't stress the fact enough of figuring out who you are, taking that to God and allowing Him to refract it through His goodwill and ways, and what kind of life it will produce. There's There will be pain, there will be suffering, there will be frustration and challenges, but that is all part of producing a life. What does Christ say? Is it Christ or Paul? This momentary suffering is nothing compared to the eternal weight of glory that awaits us. And that's just one of the many promises that I trust in. Do not be hearers of the word, but doers as well. And that's what I want to be about.
That's awesome.
That's a good word.
That is a good word. And I think the most godly thing that you can pursue to do is play the drums.
Play the drums.
Play them drums.
Obviously.
So we'll play these drums on out. Tim, thanks again so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thanks, 2 Timothy.
My pleasure.
Yeah.